from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dustin Pendell, along with Oklahoma State's Hannah Shear, will discuss their extensive survey of cow-calf producers here in Kansas, seeking out trends in management and economic performance, and they'll share their findings next. Then K-State's Ron Graber talks with K-State's Jaymelynn Farney about preparing cattle feeding pens for the coming winter months, with an emphasis on designing for good drainage from those pens while restricting runoff into nearby waterways. Later, this week's wildlife management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee looks at patch burn grazing as a means of creating favorable habitat for lesser prairie chickens. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and bringing to your attention still more information that was passed along at that recent Risk and Profit Conference hosted by K-State Agricultural Economics on the economics and management of cow-calf production here in the state of Kansas. It's a multi-layered study that our guest was involved with, Hannah Shear, who just finished her Ph.D. at Kansas State University and now is on the faculty at the Agricultural Economics Department at Oklahoma State University, and the one presenting the information at Risk and Profit, and somebody involved with Hannah's work as well, Dustin Pendell, livestock economist here at K-State. Dustin, before we bring Hannah in to share the details of this deep study, what do you see as the value of this body of information that she's pulled together?
Eric, the value information that the work that she did, either on her dissertation or subsequently, it's taken a deep dive looking at some of the production economics of cow-calf operations here in the state of Kansas. And so think about efficiency. We can talk about some of the economics, the financial side, looking at some of those drivers. And so what we hope, or what comes out of this work, is that producers can take a look, kind of figure out where they are, maybe from an efficiency standpoint, from a production efficiency standpoint, and how they might be able to maybe become more efficient, maybe compare themselves to other operations here, other cow-calf operations here in Kansas.
Well, Hannah, let's get right to your work here. This deep dive, as Dustin described it here. Where did you start? Because there are so many ways you could approach this.
Yeah, so we started first by just wanting to estimate our Kansas Farm Management Association database cow-calf producers' efficiencies, specifically technical and allocative and scale efficiency. Allocative just being how are you using your inputs, and scale efficiency just being how efficient are you scale-wise. This type of analysis is always relative, which works well in the cow-calf industry because how well you manage is very much a comparative game. I just got to do better than my neighbor type of approach. So we felt like this was a good analysis to use to help better understand what characteristics might be making certain producers more efficient. So that's where we started with the KFMA database. And we found that our larger herds tended to be more scale and technically efficient, which we expected to see and find. And we also found that if our producers wanted to improve their efficiency, that they should focus mainly on feed and labor costs. Well, I didn't have to do that huge analysis to tell any producer that. They could have told you that from the beginning. But what that kind of spurred was the need to have more data and information from our cow-calf producers in those areas. So that's where the KFMA cow-calf survey comes into play. It was originally launched in 2018. It had really good survey responses. It was revamped in 2019, though, to include more feed-oriented questions as well as breeding program questions, just to get a better idea of the management decisions that our producers are making in Kansas. So that survey was then relaunched again in 2020. And so we wanted to use those survey results and hopefully eventually pair that up with our original analysis and be able to say a little bit more about what decisions in that feed cost area are impacting our producers.
And it was clearly, by the volume of information you drew from this, a detailed survey here. You did break this down by region of the state, Hannah?
Yes, we broke the survey results in kind of three different ways. First by region, so west, central, and east. We also divided it based on profit thirds as well as herd size, because we wanted to understand where certain characteristics fell in all of those sorts of categories.
The calving approaches, that was one such area, right?
So we wanted to look at some of the calving and breeding program decisions that producers were making. A lot of this is what, if you're in the industry, you know. So our calving typically most occurred in the spring, is what our producers identified. But some of our east and central producers indicated around 40% of the time they're utilizing a combined calving season, which could mean something along the lines of they're just leaving a bull in year-round, which is a common low management technique and can reduce a lot of costs for our producers. But we also found that most of our Western producers are utilizing a shorter calving period. So a little bit higher intensity of management for our producers in the Western region.
We talk so many times about this one management step, and it's really a series of steps, but preconditioning those calves before they are weaned, and how many producers are actually employing that. You tried to get at that, did you not?
Yes. So the preconditioning questions included things like whether or not you're doing 2 rounds of respiratory vaccines, dehorning, if that applies to your breed, bunk feeding, and those types of things. And again, we found that the producers in the Western region were a little bit more higher managed in that they utilized more of the preconditioning as opposed to our Eastern regions. But most of them were still exposing their calves to most of those typical preconditioning treatments.
Well, one clear, important facet of cow-calf production would be the breeding program. You came at that with several purposes there, one of which was what informational resource do cow-calf producers typically lean on in genetic selection?
Yeah, so our producers were asked what they identified as the most important criteria for selecting their breeding or their bull. In typical fashion, our producers identified as EPDs being as one of their top criteria for bull selection, but it was followed very closely by kind of a split decision on what was the second most important criteria, being between visual appraisal and breeder guarantee.
And you found that a large percentage of producers in Kansas do, in fact, prefer to raise their own replacement heifers.
Yes. So we asked the question, do you do pregnancy checks in addition to bull soundness checks? And we found that the majority do, but we do have a large percentage, especially in our Eastern and Central region, that don't utilize those management practices. But we wanted to follow that up with, if they do those pregnancy checks and it fails, obviously the cow's not bred, what do you do? Do you sell her? Do you end up getting a replacement? And so we found most of the producers will sell immediately. They don't try to rebreed again in an off season. And then what do you do to replace those females? And we found that most of them we found that most of the producers raise their replacements instead of purchase.
Well, we are skipping right through highlights of the entire study. We should point that out. But one more area I do want to slip in here, and that is feeding practices on the part of cow-calf producers. Forage utilization they typically employ. Cover crops, are they fitting that into their nutritional management? You found a host of things here, Hannah.
Yes, and this was the question we were most interested in seeing the results for, specifically because we wanted to be able to apply that back to our previous studies. Producers were asked to indicate if they graze on full hay, warm season, cool season pasture, crop residue, cover crop, wheat pasture, or other. And they were asked to indicate for how long did they graze those particular forages. And we found that most of the producers, regardless of herd size, used full feed, hay, and supplements for around 60 to 90 days. And that most of the producers tended to utilize warm season grasses, which we would expect to see here in Kansas. But they tended to use them for longer periods of time, for more than 150 days on average. And then occasionally we saw a little bit more usage of crop residue and cover crop grazing, but there were not very many producers that indicated using other methods.
Dustin, want to bring you back in. Because this has such depth to it, how do you hope that this information that Hannah has generated can be utilized most effectively in the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And, as Hannah pointed out, she's really just scratching the surface of all this data. There's a lot of data there. The survey that's been going on for 3 years now. We're trying to marry that with the actual KFMA, Kansas Farm Management Association, enterprise level production financial data. That way we can dig deep and see, are there things that we can pull out that producers, they maybe can do a better job in doing either X, Y, or Z to really try to help them become maybe more financially better off, making those better management decisions. I think, like I said, she's just starting to scratch the surface, and I think she's got a career here that can really start to dig deep into some of these things. And for those that are interested in looking at, I don't know if it was recorded, but at least the PowerPoint slides from Risk and Profit that you noted earlier, they can find that information on agmanager.info. Also, any future fact sheets that she's currently working on will also be uploaded to agmanager.info as well.
Well, Hannah, it was great work, and it's still a work in progress, as Dustin notes. You have uncovered some really valuable information for the cow-calf production sector here in the state of Kansas. And do keep it going. Thank you for going over the information that you have to date with us. And Dustin, thank you likewise for weighing in on the importance of this work. We appreciate your time, both of you. Joining us, livestock economist Dustin Pendell of K-State and a newly graduated Ph.D. out of the Agricultural Economics Department, who is now, again, on the faculty of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. That's Hannah Shear. As Dustin notes, you can have a look at the PowerPoint presentation, which does list this information in quite some length and detail at agmanager.info. Do check it out. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Shelby Varner. Properly setting up and designing cattle pens can help cattle producers be proactive in preserving water quality in the surrounding area. That was the topic on a recent podcast produced by K-State Beef System Specialist Jaymelynn Farney, where she was joined by K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber. They outlined how a faulty pen layout can end up being detrimental to water quality.
Why is mud bad in your pens from a water quality perspective of your operation?
From a water quality standpoint and somebody that spends a lot of time working with guys and paying attention to what our the quality of the water is in our streams and rivers and, whatever leaves those pens, depending on what kind of system you have and how close to the stream you might be, has the potential to reach that water. And we know that it carries things with it. So, that's manure or that waste material that may be in your pens. And so, from that standpoint, if we can keep that cleaned up, yeah, it has some economic impacts, on our cattle operation, but it also has environmental impacts on our stream system.
How do we need to set up our pens to maintain them for the appropriate drainage, be able to easily get it cleaned out, etc.?
Ideally, we'd like to have, a minimum of 1.5 or 2% slope in those pens and, maybe up to even as much as 4 or 5%, but enough so that when we do get one of those rainfall events, and, we seem to have some fairly intense runoff events where we'll get a couple of inches in not very many hours, and we generate some runoffs. And so when we think about doing maintenance and scraping pens and, and hauling manure out, we want to reestablish that slope, and oftentimes we get low spots in our pens throughout the feeding time, and we'll have some holes or low areas that hold water, and so we may need to haul in some compacted clay and fill in those areas and kind of get that packed back down and what would be a flat surface, but a flat surface with some slope that drains out. And so, we need to pay really close attention, by where our feed bunks are at, and our, whether or not hopefully you have a feed apron behind your bunks, and, that cattle can get up on when they're eating. But, sometimes we'll see that get kind of tromped out by that apron as well. So we may need to haul some clay in there and reestablish that. We really like to see that apron be 10 to 12 foot with the bunks sitting on the edge. And so we've got, plenty of room for cattle to stand on that concrete apron behind the bunks. And it also gives us an opportunity to come in and then scrape that periodically and clean that off. Well, we sometimes, in that area behind there, we'll even recommend putting down some geotextile fabric and some screenings or something, and adding another 8 or 10 foot just to get a little more room there. So we need to pay attention to that when we're reestablishing, and also where your drinkers are at, or your waters. The same thing can happen there. So we may need to haul some clay in, and we want some really good clay where it's pretty sticky clay, but it also has some rock in it as well. And that's, that works really, really good for those kinds of areas. But, I think the main thing is to get in and, clean manure out. Don't disturb that hard base if you can, and then get in and kind of, fill in the low areas. And sometimes guys will even, if we're in something that's fairly flat, they may even have a level, a laser level, or borrow one and, try to reestablish those slopes. Sometimes below these pens, we'll have a sed basin, and then maybe go out onto a grass vegetative filter area. And, and that is another area that really needs attention. If you do have that, is to, make sure that's cleaned out, and so that it's ready to go. You may need to haul some clay back in there and fill in some areas in that. And pay attention to the area underneath the fence line, where the water does drain out, so that, we oftentimes will see kind of a ridge get built up there after a while. And so, you may need to clean that out as well. Some guys will have a piece of equipment that they can put on the front of a skid steer that's just kind of a low blade, and you can go along there and push that out, so that when we do get that runoff event, that water can actually leave the pan and not just hit that little mini terrace, if you will, and sit there. And then, and then we, again, we're back to having low areas. So work on that as well at the same time. And, just make sure that everything drains out and again, can leave the pans. And that way we can keep a pan that doesn't, we can minimize how nasty or how deep it gets, and hopefully prevent that, that 3, 4, 5, 6 inch deep mud in the pen.
You'd mentioned about the buffer strips and keeping them clean, etc. Could you expound on that just a little more?
Sure. So, we oftentimes on these grass buffers below pens, we'll recommend an area that'll be 2 to 3 times, kind of a minimum of 2 to 3 times the pen area. And so, kind of a typical design is to have that sed basin below the pen that traps a fairly large percentage of any of the materials that might come out of the pen. So we'd be, the objective would be to trap, 70, 80% of those solids, maybe more, and then the water will leave that sed basin, and, we want it to spread evenly out over that vegetative grass. And, those cool season grasses are fairly high nutrient users, so they'll utilize that the nitrogen and phosphorus that's coming out in that out of those pans. And then the idea is to hay that grass once a year, and so we're trapping nutrients, we're utilizing with the grass, and then we're haying that and removing it from the soil. And so a lot of times we'll recommend some regular soil sampling on there as well, just to ensure that we're not getting buildup of phosphorus. depending on the winter and how big the events are, we can get some material that actually comes out of the said basin and into the grass. And so we may need to come in and actually do some, clean those areas up, scrape some of that out, and actually reseed in some areas. Because we want a dense, thick stand of grass in there. That's what's going to trap nutrients the best. But just need to, pay attention to it. And if there are some areas that need to be cleaned up and reestablished, get that done. And certainly, this is the right time of year to be planting those cool season grasses. Early September is an ideal time to establish those. So, now would be a great time to be looking at that while you're doing that maintenance and, reestablishing the basin, the pens and the said basin, and, just to check all of that over and make sure that it all is kind of set up right so that if we do get some of those big rainfall events this fall, and I'm guessing we will, we usually do, so that you're set up for success.
And the thing that I see a lot with, producers I visit with is forgetting about that buffer strip. That in itself is a pretty useful tool.
Yeah, that one's the one that, if we're thinking about water quality and, in the streams or those protected water bodies, downstream from us, that's a big one, we want when the water comes out of those pens, ideally we'd like to have it spread across all of that grass, and we'd like to have that same slope that we were talking about. We want something in that 2 to 4 or 5% slope so that water will kind of flow across there gently. We don't want it to just rush across there like the rapids. So, because we're not trapping much that way. So we want it to flow across there slowly. Sometimes depending on the slope and how it lays, we may actually put a couple of terraces across there, kind of speed bumps, to slow that water down as it goes across there, because that is critical. And, to have it move across slowly so that it actually does what we want it to and functions in that regard. And so, that's just what needs to happen, and none of us want to contribute to surface water issues. So we're all, I think we all want to protect our water bodies, and we certainly don't want any calls about bad things going on in the river below us. So, so it's in our best interest to do that.
That was K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber visiting with K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. To hear more on how to properly set up cattle pens to help with water quality preservation, listen to the recent Dr. J's Beef podcast. Simply search for online or find the link at southeast.ksu.edu. For further information on this subject, contact your area watershed specialist through your local extension office. There is a K-State Research and Extension publication that provides comprehensive guidelines for planning and constructing livestock feedlots, which can be found on the K-State Research and Extension online bookstore. I'm Shelby Varner, and this is Agriculture Today, and Eric will be back with more after the break over at the K-State Radio Network.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. And on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. And starting with this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report out from the USDA yesterday afternoon. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture in the state was at only 2% surplus, 53% adequate, but 45% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 2% surplus, 51% adequate, and 47% short to very short this week. Winter wheat planting in the state underway, 4% complete now. That's right on the average. The state of the corn crop in Kansas, 53% good to excellent, 25% fair, 22% poor to very poor. Corn now dented is at 89%, corn mature at 45%, and the harvest is 11% complete now. Soybean crop condition, 59% good to excellent, 27% fair, and 14% poor to very poor, with soybeans setting pods 92%, soybeans having dropped leaves at 20%. And the sorghum crop condition at 56% good to excellent, 29% fair, and 15% poor to very poor, with sorghum now having turned color, 79% having reached maturity at 20%, and 1% of the grain sorghum crop has been harvested as of this past weekend. In its first national corn harvest report of the season, the National Agricultural Statistics Service estimated that 4% of the crop had been harvested as of Sunday. That's 1% behind the 5-year average. Meantime, the portion of the crop remaining in the field continues to reach maturity slightly ahead of normal. The USDA estimating 87% of the corn had dented, 37% of the crop was mature. And the condition of the corn crop nationally, dropping to 58% good to excellent. That is the 5th lowest good to excellent rating for the crop at this time in the past 12 years. As with corn, soybeans also continued to mature at a faster than average pace last week. The USDA's Stephanie Ho reports on that.
Soybeans dropping leaves is ahead of the 5-year average and ahead of last year.
Wide open weather, sunny conditions, generally warm, and we did see rapid progress as we head toward the end of the growing season. 38% of the U.S. soybeans dropping leaves on September 12th. That is, for the second consecutive week, we either doubled or more than doubled the pace.
That was USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
Soybean condition on September 12th. No changes from last week. Steady at 57% good to excellent, 14% very poor to poor. That is a bit lower than the 2020 season. At this point in mid-September, we were at 63% good to excellent and just 11% very poor to poor.
3 states have the worst soybean ratings.
Leading the way for soybeans rated very poor to poor, North Dakota, 42%, just behind South Dakota, 41%, and third place, Minnesota, coming in at 25% very poor to poor.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And winter wheat planting also continued ahead of normal last week nationally. 12% of the crop had been planted as of Sunday, and grain sorghum turning color at 83% on the national level and reaching maturity 39%. The grain sorghum harvest is 21% complete. That is slightly behind the average. Also in the headlines today, that tax bill forwarded yesterday by Democrats on the House Ways and Means Committee includes an array of changes to estate assets, trusts, corporate taxes, and business deductions. If the bill becomes law, many of those changes would go into effect at the beginning of 2022. The bill is considered to protect stepped-up basis for agricultural producers, but the bill cuts the estate tax exemption in half. The 881-page bill would roll back many of the provisions of the 2017 tax cuts. The Ways and Means Committee holding a markup meeting this morning to advance the bill. Now we'll hand it on over to K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook for this week's edition of Milk Lines. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning transitioning to our new corn silage. You know, many of you have harvested your corn silage for 2021 and probably starting to think about feeding it, and maybe in some cases we're even starting to introduce that to our cows. One of the things we need to think about is that the corn silage that we harvested this year might be quite a bit different than what we harvested last year, particularly in terms of grain content. I know some of the yields that I've heard even on dry land corn exceed 250 bushel to the acre. So in some cases we have some corn silage that contains a considerable amount of starch, which is a great thing, but just keep in mind it takes a little while for the cows to adjust to this. So sudden changes in your feeding from old crop to new crop should be avoided. So what is the best way to be successful in feeding this new corn silage? Well, number one, If you can wait 3 to 4 months before you actually introduce it to your herd, that would be best. This is because that starch digestibility changes for a period of time after we ensile, and it is about 3 to 4 months before we get the final breakdown or the full breakdown of the protein that encases the starch in the corn kernel. So if you can wait that long, it would be great. If not, you want to implement this new corn silage into the diet over about 10 to 14 days. So start out with a low inclusion rate, maybe only feed at 20% of the total amount of corn silage that you're including in the diet for the first 3 to 4 days, and then just gradually increase that. By day 14, you're up to feeding the new corn silage at 100%. Now, as you do that, you need to really watch the cows and milk production as well as butterfat. You see this new corn silage as it's introduced into the animals may cause some subacute acidosis, which would reduce the level of butterfat that we find in the milk. This is due to the loss in rumen pH, and this is due to the increase in the starch availability that we might be seeing in the new corn silage. There are some important tests that we should work with as we work with our nutrition program. It's important to evaluate the NDF content of this new forage as well as the starch content. In addition to that, I'd encourage you to look at the availability or the digestibility of the NDF as well as the extent of the NDF digestibility. Same is true for starch. So the rate of starch digestion and the total extent of starch digestion of this new corn silage is very important in correctly balancing the ration for your cows. It's important to work with your nutritionist to make sure that you're making a smooth transition onto the 2021 corn silage. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and across the way once more, former K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. He's here each week to talk wildlife management with us, and you share some information that is quite timely in light of the fact, Charlie, we discussed a couple of times back the proposed listing of the lesser prairie chicken as a threatened or endangered species. There's new research information out on land management that is very encouraging for promoting lesser prairie chicken.
Yes, that's a recent study published in the Journal of Wildlife Management by the Kansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit that provided some on-the-ground information that would be very useful for landowners that are interested in trying to improve lesser prairie chicken habitat. Across their range, lesser prairie chickens have declined by more than 90%. As a result, it's a conservation concern. It's significant enough that it's been proposed to be listed as threatened in the northern part of its range and endangered in the southern part of its range. We know that their lesser prairie chicken are grassland obligate birds. They require a diversity of vegetation, structure, and composition to complete their life history. And when we think about what factors are out there that influence vegetative conditions in grasslands, we know that there are several that we can do something about. That leads us to the use of the term heterogeneous habitat. And that's a habitat that is not all the same. It's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. And the more diversity in that vegetative condition you can get, the better it suits many grassland species. And that was the purpose of this research effort.
And this effort employed a management tactic that we've heard of before. It's called patch burn grazing.
Yes, patch burn grazing is burning parts of the grazing unit in subsequent years. So the entire grazing unit isn't burned all at one time and then maybe left idle for 2 or 3 years. In most situations, approximately 1/3 of the site is burned in 1 year, a different third the next year, and the final third in year 3. So that's patch, burn, and then graze. Cattle then, like many other grazing animals, their grazing pressure is strongly influenced by presence of fire, and the time periods closest to the burn are where those are grazed the most intensively, and which creates that heterogeneity. This particular study tried to quantify the effects of that patch burn grazing on the vegetative composition and the structure through those different patches that were generated through that differing times of burn.
And this was done in a couple of locations in south central Kansas, actually, you say?
Yes, the research was done in Kiowa and Comanche counties in Kansas from 2014 through 2017. They collected data during the 4 biological seasons for a prairie chicken, which would be lekking, which would be the 15th of March through the nest incubation start, nesting, which would be starting of incubation through the time of nest completion, and then post-nesting, which would be nest completion through the 15th of September, and then non-breeding season, which would be that late fall, winter, and spring season prior to March 15.
And the objective here was to evaluate how well lesser prairie chicken utilize these varying habitats within a patch burn system?
Yes, it was to see how frequent prairie chickens were using those various patches. The information was perhaps not surprising when you understand a little bit about the biological requirements of lesser prairie chicken and their dependence upon diversity in grassland systems. They found that by radio collaring female lesser prairie chickens and then following those chickens to determine what types of habitat they were using in the vegetation composition at different times of year, percent of bare ground, percent forbs, percent grass cover, and the visual obstruction, which is a measure of height and density. By collecting those biological values, they were able to determine which vegetative compositions lesser chickens were most likely to be found in at that particular biological season.
And so their discoveries here were that this system, patch burning, will generate that favorable habitat?
Yes, they found that female lesser prairie chickens selected 1 and 2 year post-fire patches during the lekking season, and then greater than 4 year after the fire patches during the nesting season. So that would tell me those greater than 4 years would be taller grasses, perhaps more litter for concealment of nests, and then they wanted very little vegetation on the surface during lekking. The vegetation selection during that lekking season was not similar to the available vegetation in selecting patches, meaning that they particularly selected for sites. It wasn't just a random decision. During the nesting season, the females selected nest sites with greater visual obstruction, which was available in greater than 4 years post-fire patches. Females also selected sites with about 15 to 25% bare ground, which was available during the year of the fire and 1 year post-fire and 2 year post-fire patches. During the non-breeding season, they selected sites with lower visual obstruction available in year of fire and 1 year post-fire patches. I think what that information tells us is that there are some very significant things that landowners can do to improve habitat conditions for lesser prairie chicken that may not have an economic impact on their operations. It's only by following along with some of these management suggestions that we're probably going to impact lesser prairie chicken populations to keep them off of the list if it's not already too late. But if we're concerned about recovering lesser prairie chicken, we're going to have to make some changes. The remaining grasslands that we have perhaps can be managed in a way that doesn't disrupt normal grazing practices, but can be more beneficial to lesser prairie chicken.
And this research, which was conducted in 2 counties in Kansas, Comanche and Kiowa, indicates that patch burn grazing may be one land management approach to, again, supporting lesser prairie chicken numbers. Charlie, thanks for going over this with us. Former Kansas State University wildlife specialist Charlie Lee there. And with that, our Tuesday edition comes to a close. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.